So let's talk about some of the things that people start doing now once they domesticated things. So first off, you start to see in the fossil record, in the archaeological record, you see first the growth of something called horticulture. So horticulture is a name we have for things like a farming way of life, a type of subsistence strategy. Again, remember, a subsistence strategy is a way that a society makes a living. Every society has to figure out a way to make a living. So again, for most of hominin history, it was foraging, hunting and gathering. All of a sudden, we have a bunch of other options. And the first one really to arise in the early archaeological record about 10,000 years ago is horticulture. Horticulture is farming, except for it's different than what you might think of as farming in a few different ways. One of which is there's not any animal labor, which might seem like not an important distinction, but it's huge because you don't have like an animal to pull a big steel plow and turn the soil over and over, which means that the soil is what it is to some degree, which means you have to figure out some other ways to keep the soil rich, because you can't use an animal pulling a plow to dig it all up, and you can't also use a bunch of human manure to use as fertilizer. And so it's driven by human labor, as humans doing the backbreaking work of going out with a digging stick and poking holes in the ground and putting seeds down. Humans doing the backbreaking work of cutting down trees to clear a farming plot. So it's human-driven farming with, quote, simple tools. And I say, quote, simple because simple is always in the eye of the beholder, right? They're very effective for what they are, but we might say non-mechanical tools. We're not talking about steel plows. We're certainly not talking about tractors. We're talking about things like digging sticks and axes. And it's growing plants non-intensively. And what I mean by non-intensively is the easiest way to explain that is to contrast it with modern agriculture. So modern farming, we often use the same plot of land over and over and over and over and over again, which seems normal except for it's totally bizarre because that's not the way it was for most of human history. That's only possible because of things like plows and tractors and fertilizers, things that basically kind of force the land to stay productive, even when naturally it would be becoming less productive every year. Even as the soil is losing its fertility, you're boosting it with things like fertilizer, you're boosting it with things like dragging a plow behind a tractor and digging up the soil to bring up fresh soil. But for horticulture and for several thousand years of human history, there was none of that. And so instead, you had to do other stuff to figure out. You couldn't intensively use the same piece of land over and over again. So instead, you had to farm one piece of land for a few years and then move to another piece of land. Or you had to figure out some way to keep that soil healthy other than sort of tools and tricks. So it's labor intensive, but it's actually really light on the land. Typically, it's fairly environmentally sustainable. Even though it's, quote, simple tools like digging sticks and axes, the techniques used are incredibly sophisticated and clever. So I'd like to share a couple. Two of the most common ways that horticulture was done historically and is still done by some horticultural groups today, such as in Papua New Guinea and much of the Amazon rainforest, is shifting agriculture cultivation, which we sometimes call swidden, and polyculture. Let's talk about both. Shifting cultivation. You might have heard by the term slash and burn. So early human groups figured out that they could burn pieces of land, cut trees, cut parts of forest, and then burn them to release nutrients into the soil, a natural form of fertilizer, and then that you could grow plants in that plot of land for a number of years. Within 3 to 5 years, or give or take, depending on where you're at, the soil loses its nutrients, and you then have to move to the next plot of land over and cut that down and burn it and grow your plants. Now, you do that, let's say 5 or 6 different times, and by the time you get back to your first plot of land that you'd farmed the first time, that's grown back with trees again. It's already starting to become a forest again. So you just start the process all over again. It's called shifting cultivation or slash and burn. And so long as population is low, which it was for most of human history, so long as you have, just a couple hundred people in your village working the land, that is totally sustainable and fine and it works. If you get up to huge populations, that could become problematic. But when it's low populations, there's enough land that you can kind of shift your farm around and just keep shifting it around every once in a while. So you have these small gardens that then you shift around every few years. And that's called shifting cultivation, slash and burn, or swidden. So that was one way of getting the land to keep being productive even once it was running out of nutrients, because human crops are they're thirsty, right? They're thirsty for nutrients, the things that we eat for food. And so you have to keep moving it around to keep things healthy. The other option was another major technique was polyculture. So some societies figured out quickly on that you could mix plants, and then you would get plants that were putting nutrients back into the soil while other plants were taking nutrients out. So a good example is that for much of the southeast of the modern United States, you had traditionally what are called Three Sisters gardens. And some people still do this today. It was very common historically, where you would have beans, corn, and squash grown on the same plot of land. So this is a form of polyculture where you use beans, corns, and squash. The idea here is the corn takes nitrogen out to grow. It's a really good food crop, but it takes a lot of nitrogen. And you don't have any artificial fertilizer like nowadays, so what do? Well, you grow beans on the same plot of land. The beans stalk grows up the corn plant, so that works well for the beans, and the beans produce nitrogen, because beans are what's called a legume. You then also have the squash, which gets these huge leaves, which acts as sort of a natural herbicide, crowding out weed species and acting as another form of good food. And also squashes can be used. You can hollow them out and use them as gourds. So you have stuff where you're naturally using the dynamics of plants and you're kind of replicating an ecosystem. And actually both of these forms of horticulture, which developed very early on in the Neolithic Revolution, both of these forms of horticulture, I think there's probably good reason to assume that humans were observing nature and then mimicking it. Because polyculture basically mimics what a forest does. It's just a much simpler version of a forest, but you're doing exactly what a forest does, which is mixing and matching plants so that things are putting nutrients back into the soil as much as they're taking nutrients out of the soil, and so that things are controlling pests. And things like slash and burn agriculture is a lot like what forests naturally do, right? Forests naturally have forest fires. They can be really tragic when they get out of control, and that's partly because we've suppressed them for a very long time. But forest fires are a natural part of how ecosystems work, and so slash and burn agriculture is kind of like just doing little mini forest fires, but keeping it under control. So both of these forms of horticulture that early humans figured out and that some human groups still practice today sort of mimic what's already happening in nature, but then sort of gear it towards human uses. So what was life typically like in these early horticultural societies and in horticultural groups today? Suddenly humans are settling down. They're becoming sedentary. Again, it's not that that never happened prior to this, but it would have happened mainly with foraging groups that like controlled a really powerful resource like a river. But once horticulture happens, you don't have to control a powerful resource anymore. Horticultural groups can kind of just be in the middle of some random chunk of forest and lay down roots and set up a village, because you no longer have to move around to follow the prey species or move around to follow the plant species as they bloom. Instead, you make the animals and plants that you want to eat come to you. And a lot of these horticultural societies would have been doing hunting part-time, but also doing growing stuff part-time. But they have these, this is where you start to see in the archaeological record, we finally about 10,000 years ago start seeing true villages, right? True evidence of large villages, and that are getting larger than just kind of a more transitory thing. So this is really where you start to actually see a lot more archaeology, because suddenly it starts to become a lot more obvious where human groups are, because they're making large stone houses and things like that. You start to see houses that are really able to provide primarily for themselves, and you start to see the beginning of social stratification. So we can tell this in a lot of different ways, including like the way in which certain people were buried in ways like with different jewels and different markers of status. But it seems like around this time period, we start to see the phenomena of big men, which is a phrase and also big women, which are phrases that we use for the idea of redistributive leaders, which is a fancy way of saying when a village has a chief that helps control where the food goes and helps take the surplus food and redistribute it out to the society and has kind of control through that way. So at a lot of horticultural groups in places like New Guinea, Polynesian Islands, prior to colonialism, what you have is you have these leaders, these big men and big women, who sort of become powerful because they're able to farm a lot, produce a lot of surplus, gather up the surplus of other people, and then if there's natural disasters, they're the ones that have, so to speak, a food storage. They can help people out, they throw big parties, they generally do things that sort of help the society along, but they're able to do that because they kind of manipulate, and I don't mean that in a bad sense of the word, but manipulate the flow of resources. It's sort of taxes, but long before there's modern taxes. And so that's intimately connected. This is sort of the first rise of government. It's not government yet. That'll wait for a little while. But we're starting to see kind of the first shadows and hints of what we think of as modern government with the rise of big men with horticultural societies. So you're starting to see villages, larger groups, hundreds of people, even thousands of people. You're starting to see the rise of status, categories of people. This would also probably be the time period where you start to see people that are sort of like full-time shamans and things like that, full-time religious specialists. So things are starting to shift. Things are starting to shift major during this Neolithic revolution. The next strategy around the same time period, so perhaps hard to say which came first, probably horticulture, but the other thing that the Neolithic revolution makes possible is what's called pastoralism. Pastoralism is the herding of animals for food production. It's usually mobile. You usually have to move your animals around because they eat all the grass if you keep them in one place, and it's usually symbiotic in the sense that pastoral groups such as the Maasai of Eastern Africa, such as the Navajo of the Southwest, such as a number of the early European groups, depended heavily on the animals they herded, and in turn the animals depended heavily on them. They domesticated the animals, but in a sense the animals domesticated them. So this is a map of different pastoral groups traditionally in the gray, and this is a map of areas that are relatively dry or wet. Relatively wet areas are blue, very dry areas are yellow. You'll notice that pastoral groups, where did they arise historically? All the dry places, okay? Northern Africa. Earlier I was calling this Eastern Africa. I always get my geography mixed up when I'm trying to describe continents. Anyways, so Eastern Africa, Southwest Asia, the place we often call the Middle East nowadays, the Southwest. These are where, not entirely, right? There's exceptions, but by and large, this is where you had a whole lot of pastoralist groups arise. Now, why would that be the case? Well, turns out cows are magic, like Harry Potter magic. And what I mean by that is cows, as well as sheep, as well as goats, as well as other animals that we herd and eat, take grass, which humans cannot eat, but which tends to be a lot of parts of the world, places where it's pretty dry, you get a lot of grass, if there is plant at all. So they take grass, something that humans can't eat because we don't have a multi-chambered stomach and it would make you gag and throw up. And then we feed that to cows, or other livestock, which do have tough stomachs and can eat that stuff, and then they turn it into things like steak, or things like milk, or things like blood. So this is some Maasai people making a blood pudding. So when pastoralism arises, humans start to realize that they can use animals to make use of environments that traditionally they would have had to either hunt on or not use. You can't. These are areas that would be hard to have farmed prior to modern agriculture. But these are areas that work really well to have an animal eat a bunch of grass, which you can't use, but then eat the animal. And actually, so, again, cows are magic, right? They take unusable stuff and make it into usable stuff. And actually to say that domestication is to use animals for meat is actually not quite entirely true. I'm going to kind of skip some of these slides because I want to make this point. Let's take the Nuer, a Central African / East African group, who were famously studied in an ethnography by Evans Pritchard and are still very much a prominent group today. Nuer are currently, by and large, and have been for centuries, a pastoral group herding cattle, who have a very symbiotic relationship with the cattle, to the point where people are often named after their favorite cattle or have a name in common with their favorite cow, to the point where people have, dozens to hundreds of different ways to refer to the coloration markings on cows, to the point where people think of themselves, Nuer people, as cattle people, right? So it's very much a part of identity, in the same way that, let's say, salmon is a part of Alaskan identity, but perhaps even more pronounced. I would say rather more pronounced. But the cows aren't just used for food, and in fact, the slaughtering of cows, although it does happen for meat, is actually relatively rare. Instead, people are using them for milk every day. Regularly, people are making an incision and drawing a little bit of blood out of the animal to then roast as blocks or boil for food, using the dung for things like insect repellent and medicine, using the urine for things like tanning of fur or making cheese, using skin and bones for containers, using the meat occasionally. So actually animals are getting eaten relatively rarely because they're more valuable alive for things like milk and blood and urine. But they do occasionally get eaten as well. Of course, you can't just live on animal matter, and pastoral groups usually exist in symbiosis with horticultural or agricultural groups, meaning they trade meat with farming groups, and so probably the very earliest pastoral groups and the very earliest horticultural groups would have been trading back and forth, meats for plants and plants for meat, respectively. And this, of course, to some degree mimics the environment as well, right? So early pastoral groups were sending large groups of cattle around the landscape, but there's always been large groups of hooved animals, and so it sort of mimics something that nature already does, but again, turns it towards human ends. It's not all that useful to humans when a huge herd of elephants are grazing the landscape, partly because elephants are pretty tough to hunt, although we do hunt them. I'm talking about obviously prior to the modern poaching crisis. I mean, like traditionally in human history, elephants are a kind of tricky food source. So it would be other large horned animals like wildebeest. But cattle are docile. Cattle let you come right up to them and kill them and eat them for food, which I know is a rather blunt way of saying it. But my point is, it takes something that nature already does, large herds of animals, and something that nature already has a niche for, right? There's already these huge grasslands, and then you kind of turn it towards human needs by making these large herds of cattle. So typically this produced groups that were now suddenly numbering in the thousands. Pastoralism tends to, much like horticulture, allows groups that are in the thousands now because you can produce a lot more food in a smaller bit of land. And when I say a smaller portion of land, again, pastoral groups typically have to move around, but even with the moving around, pastoralism is still more productive in terms of how much food it generates than hunting and gathering usually. And so as a result, you suddenly have, you would have had in the historical record, in the archaeological record, groups of thousands of human beings coming together. And I think it's kind of fascinating when you look at archaeology, that humans, as soon as humans figure out a way to produce enough food that you can have thousands, hundreds of them together at once, that's what they do. And as soon as they figure out a way to start making enough food that you can have thousands of them together at once, that's what they do. Humans almost seem to have a magnetism towards each other where we want to be in big groups. I don't feel that way. I often find big groups daunting as somebody with social anxiety, but we seem to have something in us sociologically, anthropologically, where we like big groups. I don't know if it's the fact that it allows more people for cooperation, for marriage partners, for lots of things, but we tend to clump together when we can. And so in the archaeological record, after thousands of years of being these small, little, kind of 50-person groups, once humans start manipulating the environment where they can have these big food surpluses, suddenly you see groups of hundreds and thousands. You see the rise of large villages, you see the rise of large tribes, and eventually the rise of empires.